Let us not give ourselves over to the evil that surrounds us, the fear, or threats, or the violence for the living of these days. Because our bodies are temples, as our lessons speak. They're temples to God. So let our words and our thoughts and our deeds be true and grounded in the deep love that God has for our neighbors and our world. Let us embody that in light of the coming days and this week that is ahead for us. Let the call be a call to end the hatred, the racial violence, and systemic racism and violence against the black and brown siblings on this MLK Memorial Day weekend. So, in the midst of all of our lessons today, there must be a hungering, we must feel a hungering in the midst of our anxiety. A hungering for a word from the Lord, visions from the Lord. Could it be that we're missing this invitation? Our lessons today are all about invitation, calling. Let us not miss the kingdom's goal. It is said that in our first lesson that Eli's eyes have grown dim. That could also indicate that his faith and his purpose had grown dim. He and his sons did not live up to God's expectation and did what was evil in God's sight. But God saw the faithfulness of Samuel, born of his mother Hannah, deep prayer and dedication as she is birthing Samuel into the world and dedicating him to God. Let we hear that same dedication of us. God saw the faithfulness of Samuel, and the word came to him. Could we be so bold as to invite that calling in our lives? It took Eli 3 times to finally get it because of his spiritual blindness, I would say. So be like Samuel today, to hear the call of God and the call of hope and love and action in a dark, weary land. Let us not be like Eli and his sons. As our first reading begins, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. Let that not be said of us in this time. Such a time is upon us now. So let us hunger for the living God, to hear the voice of God calling. A call goes out to the church in the world to pay attention to God's epiphany of his light, of God's light in the darkness. How rare is the word from God today. Where are the visionaries of hope in a weary land today? Such is how the word comes to us today, as we are invited to answer God's calling and accept Jesus' invitation to follow, even in the midst of anxiety. Would we be so bold as to answer God's call, to dare share hope, to feel love, share hope? Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Would we be so bold as to cry that out? Speak, Lord, for your servant church is listening. But does it come to us? It comes as a risk. Love always requires a sacrifice, obedience. The way of Samuel and the change of heart and direction in the way of Nathan and this word of Jesus, follow me. Love is what the world hungers for. Hope is what the world hungers for the sick, for the poor, for those who cry for justice, for racial justice. A word of hope, a word of love, a word of peace, a word of joy. God has not absented God's self permanently. God is about to appoint Samuel in our Old Testament, but He is God appointing us and calling us out. And will we answer, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening"? So the call of the prophet who listens to God's call bravely follows. We hunger for the beloved community in that vision of Martin Luther King Jr. of how love divine, love for others. Could we be so bold as to answer God's call and follow Jesus into the world bravely, even if we are afraid? God is about to do a new thing. Not only in our first lesson is Samuel is called as prophet, but in this world today. Something that people will remember where they were when they experienced it. Let it be love and let it be justice and not violence. To hunger for such a call to be prophetic, we are dedicated at our baptism to tend the flame of the world like Samuel tended the flame in the temple. If we are God's temple, then the flame must be born and burn in us. Let us not be in a world that has lost the taste for the bread of life, has lost God. These days need a word of God and an invitation to follow Jesus. So let us hear St. Matthew's, and let us respond, "Speak, Lord, for your servant." Church is listening. God is calling a prophetic and faithful church in the midst of a time when God longs to speak, to be heard, to speak the word to a world hungering for hope, visions of promise. Just as in our gospel, Jesus is calling an apostolic discipling church to follow Christ. Where are you going, Jesus? We might ask. And Jesus will say, "To all who hunger, I am going, who thirst for justice." Our siblings of color, to the LGBTQ community, to the poor, to the outcast, to the lonely, the sick, the imprisoned, the least, and the lost. That is where I'm going, says Jesus. And that is where we must follow. Once we hear the call of God. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Maybe we need to pray like Samuel's mother Hannah upon hearing the news that she will give birth to Samuel, a prophet, and she will dedicate that child to God. Samuel was born in the presence of God. As Hannah sings, "My heart exalts in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no Holy One like the Lord, no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, for the feeble gird on strength, and those who were full hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry are fattened with the spoil." For such a time as this, we need a word from God. For such a time as this, we need an invitation from Jesus to follow bravely, lovingly. The prophets choose hope in the midst of despair, love in the midst of hate, truth in the justice in the face of false prophets, false leaders. We enter the work of the gospel with whatever we have on hand. And so we hear, as Paul calls us in Romans, but how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in the one whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they are sent? And as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Could we be those to bring good news to those who hunger? So listen to God. God's calling us, each of us, into the world with hope and visions of love. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Follow Jesus into the world deeply, hungering for a word of love and healing and justice. This world is is seeking and groping for hope. Dare we believe that we have power of love to save the world, one person at a time. Every human being is a world unto themselves. So if we love anyone, we love the world. This urgency is now. God is still speaking. Jesus is still inviting. Will we answer? Because yes, when we answer, our lives will be transfigured. Call us into that. I love two quotes as I close that have been holding me this week. One is from Malala Yousafzai, when a Pakistan terrorist attempted to kill her with a gun blast to prevent her from going to school. She wrote this long after. The terrorists thought that it would change my aims and stop my ambitions, but nothing changed in my life except this. Weakness, fear, and hopelessness died. Strength, power, and courage was born. Let's live into those words and let strength and power and courage be born in you. That's the answer to God's call. And then I close with the words from Martin Luther King Jr., reflecting on the strength to love. The invitation is there. He spoke, "Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Violence multiplies violence, and toughness implies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. So let us love. Speak, Lord, for your servant church is listening. And hear Jesus with his hand outstretched to each of us, come and follow me."